Good morning and welcome to the latest in the RTPI's Planning Enforcement Week sessions. This one is on the regulation of and enforcement of short-term holiday lets. We've got a star-studded lineup of speakers for you this morning from virtually all around the UK. So I'm really keen to hear how approaches to enforcement are developing, and so we can all basically learn from each other. My name is Andrew Coleman. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton, which is accredited by the RTPI. My interest in this subject was piqued by a student's dissertation that I supervised a couple of years ago. And that obviously revealed that Airbnb and similar letting platforms were becoming an increasingly controversial issue, not just in the UK, but around the world. And as a result of that, I wrote an article which appeared in the April 2020 edition of the Planner, which looked at some of the ways of regulating and controlling short-term holiday lets. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our speakers. Our speaker is John Shuttleworth. He's from Cambridge. We've also got following him David Leslie, who is from the city of Edinburgh, and then Heledd Jones, who is from Gwynedd in Wales. So I'll just say a few words about John. He's been an investigator who's got 25 years experience of various local government regulatory functions, and was responsible for the UK's first proceeds of crime confiscation concerning an illegal poker club. He's been trying to understand planning enforcement for the last 15 years and has been awarded a Master's in Sustainable Planning for his troubles. Of greatest relevance to today's session, as a Principal Planning Enforcement Officer for the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, John has investigated and served enforcement notices regarding unauthorised Airbnb-style material changes of use, and to date successfully has defended them all. I believe that's about 20 cases at appeal. Finally, John is also the Midlands representative on the RTPI NAPE Network National Committee and recommends anyone not already a member to join the NAPE network at the end of this session. I'd encourage you all to think of questions to ask John and the other panelists, particularly questions which are relevant to all of the panelists. And to do that, can you write them in the questions function, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, and then I will share out those questions amongst the presenters. So if you're ready, John, I'll let you start. You don't have a PowerPoint, but you've got an exercise for all of us to do, I understand. So away you go.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, good morning to everybody, to those watching live. And if you're watching on catch up on the RTPI website at a later date, then hello. As you said, Andrew, I've not got a presentation to show you, but if you'd like to get a paper and pen ready and make any notes, then I suggest you draw a mind map as I go through my presentation. And feel free to post them on Twitter afterwards with the hashtag RTPI attached to them. Now, I got interested in this about 3 years ago when I asked a question about Airbnb at the NAPE conference up in Edinburgh. And I found out that lots of other people, of enforcement officers, were also having similar issues and didn't know what to do with them. As a result, I've also spoken last year at the NAPE conference on this subject as well, and I'm very happy to do so again today. Now, at Cambridge City Council, we've served over 20 enforcement notices regarding Airbnbs. They've all been appealed, unsurprisingly, under various grounds, such as that they should get planning permission, or they're not actually a material change of breach and the alleged breach isn't occurring. Now, thankfully, they've all been dismissed by PINs to date, and we've had no non-compliance with enforcement issues within enforcement notices. So what challenges have we found? If you want to get your paper and pen ready, and if you want to draw a mind map with the big word challenges in the middle and have about 10 arrows leading off from it, then we'll begin. So let's start. Challenge number 1 we've found, identifying the breach alleged. Now, when you get an allegation, normally it's in a phone call or an email, and it could be someone saying, I've got a hotel living next door to me all of a sudden, or I've got a B&B next to me all of a sudden. How do you know what they are? Sometimes people might say, oh, it's an actual Airbnb because I found it on the website. Now, taking all those things into account, we've come up with a generic term at Cambridge, and we call them short-term visitor accommodation, sui generis, which we all know is Latin for where on earth do we put this class? Challenge 2, evidence gathering. So if someone sends you a link for an Airbnb saying they've got an unauthorized Airbnb next door to them, you'll have a look at the location. Challenge is there's a big round dot on the website of Airbnb. It doesn't actually tell you where the precise location is, so you have to do a bit more hunting. A Google search, you might look on other holiday websites such as booking.com, Homestay, where you might find this information available. Some cases in Cambridge, we've found out that letting companies are actually specialising in short-term lettings, and they've actually set up their own individual websites just to showcase their 5 or 6 or a dozen properties that they're letting out on short term. So that's evidence gathering. You can also use your complainants, because obviously enforcement officers, we can't be everywhere all of the time. We're not omnipresent. So ask them to collect as much information as possible. Logs, times of coming and goings, anything like that. Anytime they get disturbed by people knocking on the wrong door trying to find the Airbnb. Then there's the formal stuff as well, serving PCNs, initially on the owner. Now we've found that some of the owners that we serve PCNs on aren't actually aware that their properties are being used in this manner. And they've actually let it to a third party, and it's the third party that are actually letting it out in this way. So you can send PCNs also to third parties, agents responsible. Now, the results of these are we've had Excel spreadsheets come back with bookings, and we've asked specifically on a PCN for all the records of details of the bookings for the past 12 to 18 months. And that's an incredible amount of wealth of information we can get from that. So I really recommend that. Let's look at PCN responses. That's a big challenge as well. So challenge number 3, the responses and the kickback that you get from who you speak to. I only let out 1 room. I've stopped it. I'm not doing it anymore. It's still on the website though. I'm allowed 90 days, aren't I? The law says I can use it for 90 days in this way. It's not a breach. Case law says I can. There's a market for it. You know, this city needs tourists. It needs temp workers. You know, it needs to house people that only come and work for like little amounts at the time. So then you've, as an enforcement officer, you've got a challenge of how you respond to all these different responses. Challenge number 4. This one's really important and it's quite fundamental. Is it a breach at all? Ask yourself the question, is it material change of use on an individual fact and degree basis? Now, when I first started looking into this and Googling searching for past appeals, I couldn't find any. Fortunately, when I served my first one at 17 Richmond Road, which you can Google for yourself and find it, it's there on the searches now, it will come up. There wasn't a lot of to help enforcement officers as to have a look on how you should approach this matter. But the consideration on determining whether it's a material change of use on an individual fact degree basis, this highlights the need for both information and evidence at the gathering stage. It's really important to get that amount of information, as good information as possible, because the question that you have to ask yourself is there a change in the character of the use? Now, I've been able to show that there has been through the churn. And what do I mean by the churn? Well, I mean by the comings and goings of people from the building, and that's a change in the character of the use. So I'll give you an example. I had a 10-bedroomed HMO, a large HMO, when overnight went from having people staying there on 6-month yearly tenancy agreements to all of a sudden staying there on a nightly basis. And the information that we got back from the PCN basically showed that instead of there potentially being 20 people living in this property, in a 10-bed HMO over the course of a year, there was 800, 1,000 people coming and going over 12 months period. So yeah, that's definitely a character and a change of use there. So challenge number 5, this is important as well. What is the definition of a short-term let? Currently, we don't have any in England, but I'm glad to say that Scotland are looking at this in this consultation, and they are trying to come up with a definition of short-term let. Because at the moment, what does it mean? A night, a week, a month, 3 months, less months than less than 6 months? What happens if someone comes back and says, well, I use it for free for a 3-month let, and then I have it, you know, people can stay in there for a nightly basis, and then I let it out again for 3 months. You know, what is a short-term let? Challenge number 6, and here we go on to the normal enforcement considerations. Is it expedient to take action? Is it contrary to local policy? What local policies do you have? Now in Cambridge City, we currently have a loss of permanent residential policy that we use. So we do not want any loss of permanent residential. We're quite happy to encourage new developments to come forward for short-term lettings, but we have a limited housing stock here at the moment. There's big housing pressures for people wanting housing for a whole range of reasons. And so is it contrary to policy? Is there significant harm? Is there a loss of amenity to the surrounding neighbours? You have to consider, is it fair? Is it proportionate and in line with national guidance and framework? Challenge number 7, you serve your notice correctly, you win your appeal. It is a material change of use, but how do you ensure compliance with the notice? Now, I tried this by putting down a requirement on the enforcement notice to have all advertisements removed. This naturally has been taken away by pins on every single appeal. But how do you ensure compliance with a notice? How can you prove that it's not being let out as a short-term let anymore? You could ask proof of removal of listings, for example. But apart from that, what do you do? Challenge number 8, resources. There's Andrew at the start of the week had a question on the power of enforcement, and he spoke about this. How do you deal with this additional thing to deal with where you already might be stretched at the moment? In the city, we know there's hundreds of Airbnbs visible on the website. In some places like Bath and in London, there's thousands available. How do you deal with them and prioritise them? And then challenge number 9. Is there anyone else out there who can help you? And this is where your strategic working comes into effect. Licensing, consider. Use the power of revenues. Talk to your revenues people. We've been successful in getting people to change properties from council tax to business rates. Now, business rates can be charged if short-term lets properties are being used for 140 days or more, I believe. You can also set up working groups with building control for the safety aspects, the fire service with their safety aspects. If you want to be really devious, you could get your complainants to go and report the owners to the taxman or their mortgage companies. Whatever you need to do in order to try and stop any unauthorised use that you feel warranted. And then the final one, challenge number 10, the future. We need to have workable solutions going forward. What we currently have just can't work anymore. It's not sustainable. Now, do we do this through future planning policy, through future legislation and have something drawn up on a national level? Do we tackle it through licensing and regulate it? Do we use other direct action tools like more taxation on the landlords and on the letting agents? Do we try and change the market demands by having housing policies, but actually change the demand for them and the supply for them? Well, that's the 10 challenges there. Thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to Andrew, and I'll look forward to answering any questions in due course.
Hello, Andrew. Sorry, you're muted. If you could unmute your microphone, thank you.
Sorry, basic error there. I was still on mute. Thanks very much, John. That was a great introduction to some of the challenges that we have in councils around the country. When I say that around the country, I mean the UK, in tackling this issue. And I think you've opened up lots of interesting questions there. We've already had quite a few coming in, which we can answer at the end. And I think people want to tap into the experience that you've got in Cambridge there. Okay, so I'm now going to ask David Leslie to speak to us. He's the Chief Planning Officer at the City of Edinburgh Council. He's past chair of the Heads of Planning Scotland and has represented them on government and stakeholder steering and advisory group. Most importantly for today's subject, he's been liaising with the Scottish Government on changes to the law and the forthcoming planning and licensing regulations to control short-term lets in Scotland. He received an OBE for services to town planning in 2004. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I have actually read the Scottish Government's proposals for regulation of short-term lets, and the RTPI has responded to those. I'd encourage you all to look at the RTPI's response. Generally speaking, it's kind of welcoming the proposals as pragmatic. There are concerns about the resource implications, but I think personally that this could be a template for us to move forward in England and Wales as well, to regulate short-term lets where there is that need to do so. So I'm going to hand over to David now. You've got a PowerPoint presentation, David, I understand. So if you want to get that set up, we can hopefully all watch that. Please, I'd encourage all the attendees to submit your questions through the question function on the right-hand side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. Hopefully my presentation is coming up on screen fairly shortly. Perhaps somebody could let me know when it's visible.
Yes, we can see it, David. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting to follow on to what's just been said. I think a lot of the points that have just been made would resonate with our enforcement officers in Edinburgh. And hopefully what I'm going to cover in this presentation will develop those points. And also what Andrew just said about the emerging situation in Scotland. So I think 4 points that I want to cover this morning. First of all, give you a little bit of background as to where we've got to the position we're in Edinburgh. Quite an intense situation in terms of short-term lets in the city. Explain a little bit about the Scottish Government's proposals, where they've reached in terms of moving forward. Take you through the Edinburgh approach so far and our next stages, and then highlight a few lessons, which I think probably resonate very well with what has already been said. So a little bit of background, first of all, to share the context that we're working in. Where does the national position come from in Scotland? There was an advisory panel set up on the collaborative economy, which did look at this question of host-to-host sharing of accommodation. That was quite helpful, and the City of Edinburgh Council fed in various aspects of our experience in the short-term let accommodation market to that expert panel. They were obviously looking at the positives and negatives for the economy and recognising that across Scotland, tourism economy is quite different in rural areas from the urban areas. Nevertheless, they did identify there were issues that the government should be identifying. That was happening at the same time that the Planning Scotland bill was going through the Scottish Parliament, 2017-2019. So a number of MSPs picked up this issue, particularly those in urban areas like Edinburgh, and sought to make amendments to the bill. The outcome of that process is in the Planning Act, which was passed last year, which has a provision for the designation of short-term let control areas. I'll come back to that. It was something which Edinburgh supported when that came forward. What's the situation in Edinburgh? Well, there are very rapid growth over the last 5-6 years in the number of properties advertised for short-term lets. Of course, some dispute about the actual number and which of them are fully let or part posted. Nevertheless, very significant impact on the city centre and the inner city. And for those of you who know Edinburgh, you'll recognise that the city centre and inner city has a very large residential population. It's one of our specific features as a city that we have people living right in the centre of the city. So the impact has been considerable in terms of the loss of homes in those areas, the erosion of communities and community spirit, big impact on amenity, and generally the unsuitability of short-term letting and tenements. And again, many of you will be aware that characteristic of many Scottish cities is a very dense tenemental core, and of course if there are properties where there are short-term lets, and they're sharing common accesses with residents. And no feeling from local communities that short-term lets don't contribute to supporting local services. We started looking at this issue 5-6 years ago. A number of council committees are involved, not just planning, but housing, economic development issues, licensing issues, etc. And one of the first things we did was to consider how we could tackle this in a joined-up way. Two approaches taken. One in terms of members, member officer working group set up. They take evidence from a wide range of experts in terms of short-term lets, both the positives and negatives, and speak to the industry. And alongside that, a cross-services, what we call a virtual team, a cross-services officer group has been operating for the last couple of years, sharing experience, sharing information, and developing a joint approach to enforcement within the city. Through that, there's been communication with the short-term let operators, representative bodies, and communities generally. And the outcome of that was we have done quite a bit of lobbying of Scottish ministers through the legislative process and thereafter in terms of what we need as a city to support our approach. What's the government proposed so far in Scotland? Well, as was said a few minutes ago, we've just finished a consultation process in Scotland that ended last Friday on the first two aspects of these. First is a licensing system under the Civic Government Act, which would have a mandatory element and a discretionary element at local level in terms of a licensing approach. The second is to prioritise the introduction of the short-term let control areas, which are contained in the Scottish Act, the 2019 Act. So the consultation has focused on how both of these could be brought forward. The government's timescale for that is to lay regulations before the Scottish Parliament before Christmas and to have them operational in April of next year, which gives us as local authorities quite a challenging timescale in terms of implementing, but the process in Edinburgh very much is a commitment to doing that as fast as possible. There's a third element to Scottish Government's approach, which is a review of taxation, but that has not come forward in the current consultation. So what's the Edinburgh approach been so far? Very much along the lines of what's just been set out in the 10 challenges that John was speaking about. Building an evidence base was really important, and from a policy perspective, moving forward to our next local development plan, quite a lot of work has been done on that. What we were doing in a cross-service approach was very much looking at what powers do we have as a local authority to manage the situation that we have at the moment, including planning and antisocial behaviour orders. And then we wanted to define what our ask was in terms of regulation that we did not have the powers for. The priority of planning enforcement in Edinburgh has been very much focused on those that are operating on a commercial basis and where there is evidence of harm to residential amenity, which is being reported by neighbouring residents and which we can evidence. I think if I go back to my point about tenemental areas and the locational concentration within the city, then you'll understand why we're taking this approach. So very much focus on short-term lets operating within flatted property where there is an impact on residential amenity. This is quite a busy slide, but I just want to point out that in terms of a policy basis at the moment, our current local development plan does not include a policy against the loss of residential use, and that has been an issue from an enforcement point of view, but it does include a policy about inappropriate uses in residential areas, and that has been the policy on which we have focused our attention when assessing proposals if an application is being made and when assessing we take forward enforcement action where there is not a change of use and there is an application made. We do, however, have non-statutory guidance for businesses, which we amended about 5 or 6 years ago to address this question of short-term commercial visitor accommodation, which was the terminology we were using, and very much there indicating that we will focus on the character of the new use, its impact on the wider area, its impact on residents, the size of the property and the pattern of use which that short-term let would generate. And that's been a very, very useful set of guidance and has been endorsed through planning appeal decisions. Most importantly, we've indicated very clearly that we will not normally grant planning permission in respect of platted properties where a potential adverse effect on amenity of residents is raised. Again, the tenemental issue that I've referred to. So actually, again, along the lines of what we've just heard in the previous presentation, very much our enforcement officers spend a lot of time to gather evidence. Absolutely the case that these are not easy enforcement cases to deal with. They take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resource through site visits, speaking to the operators, establishing exactly what the use is and the pattern of use, and making sure action is commensurate with the breach, using the joined up service approach within the council to share information. Really reinforcing the point that recent appeal decisions have supported the council's approach, particularly on these 2 points about identifying in short-term lets that the frequent movement of those who are occupying the short-term let as visitors does have an impact on common areas of shares and common entrances, and that is quite different from the pattern of residents, and the necessity for daily servicing of apartments likewise is different from a normal residential use. So really reporters identifying in their appeal decisions and supporting us that the pattern of use is different from residential, that change of use has taken place, and they are upholding our enforcement notices. We've had a 100% success rate in these areas, so the ones that we've taken to that stage. On the policy front, we are in the process of developing our next local development plan. Important that the choices report on which we consulted earlier this year, those of you are familiar with the Scottish process, that's the main issues report for the next local development plan. We consulted on 2 proposed changes. One, the idea of designating a short-term let control area or areas in the city, and also on the creation of a new policy on the loss of homes through alternative uses. Both of these proposals received a very high level of support from respondents in that consultation exercise earlier this year. So it gives us a good basis on which to develop a policy to support short-term let control area or areas in Edinburgh. So finally, just a few bullet points in terms of lessons from my perspective in Edinburgh. Firstly, gather evidence of local characteristics and impact, really understand how short-term letting is impacting on your area. Secondly, the use of a virtual team of officers has been an extremely useful way of sharing information about particular cases, gathering information about ownership, and ensuring that our enforcement officers are working as efficiently as they can be. One lesson from that, though, has been that in the absence of any licensing regime for short-term lets, the focus of enforcement action in Edinburgh has been very much through the use of planning powers, and that has put a tremendous pressure on the planning service. Having said that, the enforcement team has been refining its processes throughout this working period of the last couple of years, and is working more effectively because of the way they're working with officers and other services. And I think that concludes with a lesson that we have resulted, this process has resulted in quicker decisions and good outcomes with no enforcement appeals upheld and properties returning to residential use in these areas, which ultimately is the objective of the council. So I think I'll stop at that point and hand back to Andrew.
Thank you very much, David. That that was most informative, and it's great to see Scotland leading the ways, and hopefully the rest of the UK governments will follow in some form or other, to at least give councils the opportunity to regulate if they feel the need to. That's me speaking in a personal capacity, not those of the University of Brighton, I hasten to add. Right, I'd encourage you all to carry on asking questions. We've already got lots actually, which we will address towards the end. I would also encourage you to direct your questions possibly to specific speakers. I would certainly be interested to hear about some of the successes in Edinburgh and elsewhere in Scotland, if David can fill us in on that later on. I'm going to move on now to Heledd Jones, who is a planning policy team leader within the Anglesey and Gwynedd Joint Planning Policy Service. Her main role is to aid with the preparation of local development plan for the Anglesey and Gwynedd local planning authority areas, for which she has responsibility for retail, economic development and tourism policies. Heledd has worked for Gwynedd Council since 2005 and has a specific interest in the role of the planning system in regulating short-term holiday lets. So, are you ready, Heledd?
Hopefully.
Super. Okay, I'll pass over to you then.
Can you just confirm that you can see my screen and the presentation?
Yes, I can. If you can put it on to presenter, that's it. Lovely.
Yep. Thank you. So thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. I'm Heledd Jones and I work as a team leader within the Joint Planning Policy section for Anglesey and Gwynedd Council. Both authorities are rural authorities based in North West Wales, which are popular tourist destinations. During this presentation, I'll give a brief run through of the research work which we're currently undertaking in relation to short-term holiday lets. So in terms of the background, short-term holiday lets is a phenomenon which has vastly evolved over recent years, along with associated impacts being economic, political, environmental and cultural. Growth in the holiday home industry is largely attributed to the accessibility of the online marketing websites, the perceived financial investments associated with holiday lets, and the growth of the tourism industry in Wales. Due to the increasing concerns relating to the impact of short-term holiday lets on local communities, Gwynedd Council agreed that research work should be undertaken on behalf of the council that specifically related to holiday accommodation in the context of Gwynedd and the national context. Other authorities in Wales were contacted to see if they were interested in participating in the research work, and subsequently Cardiff are also part of the research. It is hoped that using both Cardiff and Gwynedd as case studies will provide a wider picture of the matters relating to short-term holiday lets that affect rural and urban areas, thereby strengthening any subsequent conclusions and recommendations. The aim of the research paper is to gain a clear understanding of the possible options for controlling, managing the use of a dwelling as a short-term holiday let. So back in 2001, the Welsh Government commissioned research work relating to this matter. The overall focus of the study was to consider the role of the land use planning system in controlling new housing development, its occupancy and its use, together with the regulation and occupancy of existing dwellings. The study at the time concluded with 22 specific recommendations. The recommendations include a range of issues ranging from ensuring a sufficient supply of affordable housing, exploring the possibility of developing sites specific for second home and short-term holiday let purposes, and ensuring that there's an improved system for collating information relating to the data surrounding short-term holiday lets and second homes. Of greater significance is a recommendation within the study not to change the use class order, as it was determined that it would cause fundamental problems in terms of definition and enforcement. So it's nearly 20 years since the study was commissioned by the Welsh Government. Since then, the number and impact of holiday homes on rural communities have changed significantly, resulting in growing pressures from local communities and opposition parties for the Welsh Government to act on the issue. So a crucial aspect of the research work involves collating information relating to the number and location of short-term holiday lets. So the first table on the slide presents information relating to the number of combined second homes and short-term holiday lets within Gwynedd Council and Cardiff Council area. So the combined percentage for Gwynedd is 11.88%, with a combined percentage for Cardiff of 1.91%. The second table then relates to the global figure for Wales over the past 30 years. So as you can see from the table, from 1991 to 2001, there was a drop in the number of short-term holiday lets in Wales, and then there's a significant increase from 2001 to 2020. The following chart provides a visual snapshot of the current situation in Wales. The number of second homes for each authority is shown in green, with the number of short-term holiday lets, those which pay the non-domestic business rates, shown in orange. As you can see from the chart, the areas of Wales with the highest number of holiday homes are the traditional rural areas of Gwynedd, Pembrokeshire and Anglesey. Another useful source of information is AirDNA. AirDNA gathers information about companies that advertise holiday accommodation on peer-to-peer platforms such as Airbnb. These statistics show a significant increase in the use of peer-to-peer platforms for all the local authorities within the DNA pilot study area, and significantly more so for Gwynedd, which is the brownie coloured line. What is also demonstrated here is a notable peak periods for city locations such as Cardiff, with a significant peak during June 2017, which coincides with when the Champions League final was actually held in the city. So the map on your screen now represents each community, town and city council within the Gwynedd local authority area, showing the percentage of combined second homes and short-term holiday lets. So as you can see, the areas with the most short-term holiday lets are in the coastal areas, for example, Abersoch on the Llŷn Peninsula and Aberdyfi in Meirionnydd, with a figure which exceeds 40%. This map represents the same information for Cardiff, however, the percentage is significantly lower in Cardiff, with the highest concentration in the city centre and in the Cardiff Bay area. So in terms of the impact which high concentration of short-term holiday lets and second homes have on the area, one noticeable impact is increased house prices. The average medium house price in Gwynedd in 2019 was 155,000. However, in Abersoch, for example, the medium average house price is 365,000. 91.6% of the local population of Abersoch are therefore priced out of the housing market. Another knock-on effect of short-term holiday lets include the effect of social cohesion and culture. Gwynedd is the local authority with the highest number of Welsh speakers in Wales at an average of 65.4%. The number of Welsh speakers vary greatly, with the highest percentage in Llanrug at 87.8% of Welsh speakers and the rate of 5.15% of short-term holiday lets. Whereas in Aberdyfi, where the rate is 43.31% of short-term holiday lets, only 35.5% of the population are Welsh speakers. Another issue is an ageing population and the lack of permanent population to support and maintain local community services and facilities, such as local schools, community halls and post offices. There is also the threat that the rural economy, especially in Gwynedd, can become dependent on the tourism sector. Further, and during peak periods, and this has been even more apparent during this summer, local infrastructure, local road networks and parking facilities aren't able to cope with the increased pressure and strain which is placed upon them. The impact of short-term holiday lets differ from rural and urban communities. In Cardiff, for example, the main issue is the sporadic use of residential dwellings as short-term holiday lets, especially when large-scale events are taking place in the city, such as the Six Nations. This impacts on the residential amenity in terms of noise and disturbance, antisocial behaviour, littering and parking. So there are examples which have previously been discussed during the presentations relating to cities and countries across the UK and beyond that are seeking a proactive solution to this problem. The regulatory approaches vary and are likely to be dependent upon contextual factors relating to how short-term holiday lets are affecting the local area. Some examples which have been discussed include the requirement to gain planning permission, which is the current approach in London, and the approach which has been advocated in Scotland with the introduction of the short-term let control areas. Other control measures include the licensing system, which will be implemented in Scotland along with the control areas. Cities on the continent which have high levels of short-term lets also advocate the licensing system, such as Barcelona, Paris and Berlin. So lastly, in terms of the possible solutions to the problem, following the research work and the evidence gathering, it is suggested that the impacts which high levels of short-term holiday lets is having on local communities require some form of regulatory control mechanisms to be implemented in Wales. The research paper identifies the following mechanisms as a means of tackling the issue. So firstly, the requirements for short-term holiday lets to obtain licence before being able to let a property as a short-term holiday let. This would be akin with the approach in Scotland and similar to the licensing system which is currently operational for HMOs. Secondly, it is suggested that the Town and Country Planning Use Class Order should be amended to include a specific use class relating to short-term holiday lets. This approach is likely to be challenging in terms of the process of amending the legislation, defining the use class and the possible implications for short-term holiday lets which are currently operational. However, the benefits of being able to control the use of a dwelling house through the land use planning system is likely to be the most effective means of gaining control. Further, it would rid ambiguity relating to when the change of use of a residential dwelling into a short-term holiday let has occurred based on fact of degree, and these are challenges which has previously been discussed by both John and David. Thirdly, it is believed that the taxation system should be reviewed. In Wales, local authorities are given the powers to raise a premium of up to 100% on second homes. Gwynedd currently raise a premium of 50%, whereas Cardiff haven't implemented the premium. Since the premium has been implemented in Gwynedd, there has been an increase in the number of properties which transfer over from paying the second home council tax premium to register as a non-domestic self-catering business. However, if a property has a rateable value of less than £6,000, which most self-catering holiday accommodation do, they are then eligible for small business rates relief, meaning that they don't pay any tax on the property. Another mechanism could be the implementation of tourist tax. Once again, Scotland are leading the way in the UK with the intent to bring in a tourist tax system. This could be a means of raising funds, which then could be used to alleviate the problems associated with short-term holiday lets, such as contributing towards affordable housing and local infrastructure. Lastly, and in the short term, local planning authorities could be innovative in their approach to controlling the use of new built dwelling houses as short-term holiday lets through the current planning policy framework. For example, within the Anglesey and Gwynedd Joint Local Development Plan, there is a local market housing policy for areas with high concentration of short-term holiday lets. Another policy approach could be the application of a primary residence condition, similar to the current approach in the Northumberland National Park Authority and in St Ives in Cornwall. So lastly, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to run through the current research work which is currently being undertaken.
Thank you very much, Heledd. That's a great presentation about the research, which I always think, you know, especially with maps, we're all planners, we like maps. It's great to see how you have researched the issue in Gwynedd and also in Cardiff, because I know obviously they are very different places. As a frequent visitor for decades now to St David's, I've seen how that very small city, how its character has been changed over the years by this kind of shift in tourist accommodation. Right, okay, we have had lots and lots of questions during the presentations, and I have been sending those to the other panelists. So I'm going to ask, first of all, John, if he could come back and attempt to answer some of the very detailed enforcement type questions that we've got. So the very first one was, given Airbnb agree terms and conditions with a house owner in order to provide a platform to advertise and confirm booking dates, etc., would this relationship constitute an interested party so that they can be issued with an enforcement notice, or could they at least be included on the enforcement notice via the host as intermediary?
Thank you, Andrew. I see there's about a dozen questions that I've got to answer in this period, or many as possible, so I'll be as brief. Firstly, before I answer that one, that is what your mind map should look like. The changes. So with Airbnb, yes, you can certainly PCN them. They are an interested person, and also an interested person using it for any purpose. So please do. I know that Airbnb are quite responsive to London boroughs, and they've actually been meeting with planners in the London boroughs. I've got anecdotal evidence from the London Borough of Newnham, who are situated, if you want to know what Olympic legacy from 2012 is, well, try an alleged 8,000 Airbnbs in your London borough. So yeah, that is, but yeah, please, yeah, go. I mean, we've apparently got a good reputation for dealing with planning authorities, so have no fear in contacting Airbnb directly. That would be my advice.
Okay, the next question, I think actually that relates to a question we had from Neil Harris as well, further on down, if you want to scroll down there, which was about whether we should be, as planners or enforcement officers, trying to involve Airbnb in these discussions. So I think that's a kind of cautious answer, yes, from you. What about you, Heledd and David? Have you had engagement with Airbnb and the other platform providers? David first.
Yes, we have. We engaged them in the early discussions in our member officer working group, and we've had separate meetings as well. Obviously, because of the process which the Scottish Government is consulting on over the last few months, they will have been engaging as well at a national level. I have not seen their response, or indeed wider representative groups in the industry, the responses to the government's consultation, but I expect that they are perhaps not responding in quite the same way that planning authorities in Scotland are. That we obviously think it's a fairly proportionate response by government to our ask for more regulation and for clarity to assist planning enforcement. Whereas I would anticipate that Airbnb's response is one that it's a rather too heavy-handed response. And we have had correspondence in Edinburgh with Airbnb, where Airbnb pointed to examples in the international context and how other tourist cities in Europe have responded. So I look with some interest to that dialogue continuing over coming months as to not only what the final proposal will be in Scotland, but actually how do we implement it, because we have some local decisions to make, and I think further discussion with Airbnb and the representative bodies will be helpful.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. Heledd, have you
Yes, so I haven't had a direct discussion with Airbnb relating to the research project. I'm aware that the tourism section within the council are in contact with them in terms of the regulation of Airbnb.
Okay, yes. I mean, if you look at the practice of what's been happening around the world, they have been getting involved in discussions. You mentioned Heledd, Barcelona, and I know also they've been involved in some discussions in Portugal, which has now introduced since 2018, has had a licensing system for Airbnb type properties. So yes, I expect them to get involved in that. Right, another question for John. Well, all presenters, do you have a template or standard planning contravention notice that they use and would be willing to share? This is to make it clearer on the information required to determine material changes of use and breaches. We had another question about material change of use when it does occur, and also whether you can go back to a single family dwelling without planning permission. I'd encourage everyone listening and watching, if you've got answers to some of these questions, if you can type them into the question function, and the organisers will, I think, can make those visible for everyone. So yeah, if any other people listening and watching can answer some of these questions, they can type their questions in as well. So John, that question about standard PCN, planning contravention notice.
Yes, so anyone who's lucky to be a member of the National Association of Planning Enforcement Network in the RTPI has contacted me already, and I'm happily provided copies of templates. And I see further down on the questions, and as someone said, but Edinburgh actually took inspiration from a copy of the PCNs that we used initially. So I'm more than happy. If someone wants to ask for one, I will send them. If you want to send an email to me at john.shuttlewood@cambridge.gov.uk. I know my bosses are watching, so I'll do it in my spare time. I'll send the PCNs on to you.
Thank you. Another question for you, John. The key factors you'd look for in determining fact and degree. Some examples have been given: noise, laundry services, taxi comings and goings, or do you rely more on the transient nature due to turnover?
You know what, Andrew, all those 4 or 5 things you've mentioned then, I use them all. Throw everything at it. Let the when you're writing your appeals and the enforcement notices, throw them all in. They're bound to be appealed. Let the inspector be decided. That's my tactic.
Okay.
As long as you've got the evidence, to justify that, yeah, throw them all in.
Okay. Have you got any reflections on that, David, from Edinburgh?
Yeah, I suppose it's repeating what I said earlier about our focus on identifying properties which are no longer the principal residence of anyone, and particularly having the high amenity impact. So it's largely tenemental properties that we focus our enforcement activity on. Likewise, learning from the appeal decisions where we've been successful, we effectively have that checklist of issues which enforcement officers are using. So, like John, we'd be happy to share that with people. Probably not adding terribly much though to what John's already said. But if anybody wanted to get in touch with me about the Edinburgh experience, delve a little bit more deeply, then happy to share. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Another question for John, which has got some abbreviations in which I don't understand, but hopefully you will do. Surely short-term let in the PRS is defined as rentals of less than 6 months. Thereafter, use of AST kicks in for less than 6 months or more. Do you know what that means, or anybody else?
Well, don't know what PRS means, but I understand what the question is asking.
Okay.
And the bottom line is that, you know, in housing legislation, you will have assured short hold tenancies, or ASTs. But you know, back in the day when I was a tenant, if I wanted to go and rent a room or a house, it would be on a 6 month or a yearly tenancy. Now, obviously, these short-term lets don't have them. So how do you define a short-term let? I think that's linked to.
Yeah, okay. Right, I'll try and pick a question. Actually, we are 1 minute from the official ending of this, but I'm going to ask, can the panelists stay on to answer more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, and that's not a problem with the organisers, I understand, with the RTPI. So, right, right, this is a very good general question, which I think all of our panelists may be able to help with. John, you mentioned looking at the advertising for Airbnb, etc. Are you proactive in doing this, or do you wait for complaints from local residents?
Well, you know, it's about resources. You know, there's 2 of us in the city. There's 4 in South Cambridgeshire. We're already incredibly stretched, and as Adam Shepherd said in the first webinar of this week's presentations, he actually highlighted the need for more resources in planning enforcement in local authorities. And so we are purely proactive. We are acting purely at the moment on trying to deal with harm, or alleged harm, that is being caused. If there was to be additional funding for a team put together, I know some more well-resourced authorities like Westminster Council have a seasonal team that deal with it. But yeah, at the moment we can only do what we can do.
Resourcing is one of those issues that the Scottish consultation touched on, isn't it? Do you want to say something about that, David?
Yes, and I think it's something which RTPI Scotland picked up in their response to government. Yeah, from the Edinburgh perspective, we can definitely point to the huge impact on the planning enforcement team. It's a very dominant area in our work at the moment. We were fortunate to receive some additional resources within the council and recognition of the impact of this issue on the city. But of course we could have more, and we could be more proactive if we had more resources. I think the challenge moving forward is how do we implement from April of next year? How many planning applications will we receive for a change of use retrospectively and in terms of properties? And we are in a process at the moment within council services in Edinburgh of thinking about how do we scope that. How do we introduce a licensing regime? What pressure will that licensing regime put on the planning system if you have to demonstrate that you already have planning permission for the property when you're applying for a license, or that you have submitted an application for planning permission. And obviously from the planning service perspective, we need to be resourced to a level where we can quickly make these decisions so that the licensing process is not held back, frustrated in some way. So we're in the process of trying to quantify now what that will be, which of course is not just an impact on the enforcement team, but an impact on development management teams generally in handling applications.
And Heledd, have you got any observations on that, the resource implications, and whether you are responding to complaints from local residents, or is it you being more proactive?
It would be a matter of responding to complaints. Again, as John said, echoing John's words and David's words, it's all to do with resources. And I think in an ideal world, we'd all like to be proactive with this issue, but yeah, there's all down to resources. Okay.
Well, from my reading of the Scottish proposals, they are supposed to be cost neutral through the licensing proposals, but whether that's true or not, time will tell. Right, a question for all of you. Has anyone attempted area-wide Article 4 directions? And I think I'd like to add something to that, which is, can you see a case in which you might want to also apply an area-wide local development order, which grants planning permission through a local development order for short-term lets in your areas? David first.
A simple answer in terms of the questions you put in, no, because the from Scotland under the new Act is to consider these control areas being designated. So I think the question which we will have in Edinburgh is whether a citywide control area would be appropriate, or whether we identify particular parts of the city. And obviously there are perhaps unintended consequences of defining boundaries around certain parts of the city, which may just push the problem into other neighbourhoods. So we are exploring that at the moment. The decisions have yet to be made. I think the provisions in the Planning Act and the procedural regulations which Scottish Government will prepare in coming months take us into the realm of potentially designating an area or areas in a similar way to that in which conservation areas are designated. So there would be consultation and it would require a decision approval of Scottish ministers. So we're going to have a very robust evidence base to justify that. I think that's a Scottish solution in terms of the answer to your question. Within a control area, all properties used for a short-term let would require planning permission. That makes it very clear. So that's something that, as a city council, we favour that approach.
Okay, thanks. Heledd.
Yeah, I think a similar approach would probably be advocated in Wales as well, or locally, whatever, in Anglesey and Gwynedd. So if the regulatory mechanisms were put in place, for example, if you did require change of use planning permission for short-term holiday let, I would foresee that we then, through the local development plan, would recognise some form of control area, which would more than likely be dependent on the level of provision already in that area. So, for example, currently now, if applications do come in for new build short-term holiday lets, those are restricted in areas where there is currently a threshold of above 10% short-term holiday lets and second homes within that community council area. So I think a similar approach would also be taken if we had the powers to implement it. So if the control mechanisms were put in place.
Okay, thank you. What about in Cambridge?
Well, I think the introduction of an Article 4 direction across Cambridge, for example, would be too much of a blunt tool, purely in my opinion. I mean, the idea of reinforcement is to uphold the wishes and the desires of the planning system in general through the national framework and through the local plans. Now, we're quite happy having some short-term lets in Cambridge, because we obviously realise there is a need, but also would like to have control of where they are and what they look like. At the moment, these are massive, instances of change of uses to short-term lets. Isn't very democratic for a start. And ultimately, I don't think it would actually stop people changing them. I think they'll just, still at the end of the day, will turn around and say it's not a material change of use. Okay,
yes, that's an interesting point there at the end. And I don't suppose from the tone of your responses, any of you foresee the prospect of a local development order actually granting permission for these anywhere? I mean, could there be deprived parts of your areas which might actually welcome short-term holiday lets, where you might want to encourage it in the interest of balance? Yes, John.
No, I was just going. No, sorry, David. I was just going to say there's areas of growth on the fringes of Cambridge where short-term lets are required, basically for visiting doctors, professors, people working in our biomedical campuses.
Yeah.
People currently stay in houses dressed up for short-term lets. There's clearly a need, and I'm sure that there could be small areas where you could have such orders in place.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I mean, I can see that in Brighton and Hove that could potentially be part of the solution, although the council here is thinking much more about an Article 4 direction approach, which is already introduced for houses in multiple occupation in areas particularly affected by those. And there are certain parts of the city which have very high concentrations of short-term holiday lets, particularly off the seafront. And I think they'll be thinking about that. Yes, David.
Yeah, I was going to add that sometimes in these discussions we present a very negative perspective of short-term letting, and it is important, including in Edinburgh, to recognise that self-catering accommodation is a very important part of the accommodation market to support tourism in the city. So I wouldn't be wanting to give the impression that the council is completely against short-term letting. Quite the opposite. It's about managing it in a way where it will have the least impact on residential amenity and the least impact on communities. So we have granted planning permission for the change of use of properties for short-term letting. The recent applications which committee have approved have tended to be commercial properties, where probably a small office use is being converted into holiday flats, and often in locations where residential amenity would not be of the highest quality. And these properties have got their own access, so they're not sharing any shared access with residents. So a ground floor flat where in a sort of Edinburgh New Town situation, which may have been in a commercial use, often can prove to be quite a useful property for short-term letting. It doesn't have an impact on residential amenity. Or a small building, which has previously been one or two small offices, often can be converted quite easily into visitor accommodation in that way. I think our focus, and I suppose back to your question about would we grant a blanket order, I think that's very unlikely, because the nature of the diversity of the properties in an area is such that we would find a lot of properties would impact on residential amenity, and that wouldn't be an appropriate way forward. But yes, there are definitely locations where short-term letting in the city is a positive addition for the tourist economy.
Okay, all right, thank you. Right, I'm going to ask you a specific question, David. Have you served any enforcement notices on houses, not flats, and were the notices upheld on appeal?
Yes, I think of a couple. We did serve a notice on one property, which was not a flatted property, where we considered the impact on the residential area. In other words, the immediate neighbourhood would be negative, and that was upheld on appeal. the reporter's view was that there wasn't sufficient damage to residential amenity, and the property had its own access and so on. There was no common sharing. I'm also thinking about a property which, not a house, but a ground floor flat with its own access, but part of a residential street. Committee recently took the view, contrary to recommendation actually, that they would refuse the application because there was a potential impact on residential amenity of a second access to the property coming off a common stair, and also the feeling that visitors arriving at times in this quiet location would be damaging. But we've actually just had the appeal decision this week on that, and the appeal's been upheld and permission granted for that change of use. So I think, you know, it is back to our question about fact and degree, about the level of impact on residential amenity and the neighbouring, and unless there is very clear evidence of damage, then I think this is why we have been focusing on the most robust cases of evidence that we have, and therefore success rate in that. But these other cases I'm quoting, perhaps lesson learned that the evidence is not quite as robust, and reporters are more happy to grant.
Okay. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions that kind of about the kind of wider impacts of short-term holiday lets, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in as a planner. So I'd ask all of you, in terms of the impact on not just things like amenity and the comings and goings, but things like housing, land supply, some of the cultural aspects that Heledd mentioned. I know that's certainly been a reason for opposition in places like Barcelona and in parts of Lisbon. How are you kind of using those as reasons for refusal? I think I remember seeing an appeal statement from, I think it was Cambridge, that did refer to housing, land supply. I did my own back of the envelope calculation in Brighton. The number of properties on the DNA website could account for over a year of the council's required housing land supply, and house a third of the people on the council's housing register, if they were all turned over to, you know, permanent residential short hold tenancies kind of thing. So are you taking those kind of wider aspects on culture and housing land supply? Are they being used as reasons for refusal, say? So John.
We've not used them specifically in the enforcement notices. However, we have expanded our arguments and used them in our statement of cases appeal stages, most definitely, because, you know, it obscures basically the provisions that our colleagues in planning policy have to try and research and come up with the next local plan policies. And the bottom line is, if you've got areas of the city that are basically used for tourist lettings of short-term lets, and you've got libraries and other community facilities within those areas, and they're not being used as much, and obviously those community facilities have to keep their own records of footfall, the amount of use. Now, future council funding for those services may well be dependent on those services, such as libraries or leisure centres that might be not be used as much. So it's really important that that whole argument about areas of cities and towns becoming ghost areas, and, you know, and it's almost like the same as city centres. I don't think we want our city centres to be some kind of, you know, some kind of Disneyland area, if you know what I mean, where there's no actual real day-to-day workers or residents within there. I think that would be absolutely tragic if that was replicated all across the nation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Heledd.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, so considering the impact is definitely something which we would need to consider, especially when we develop specific policies within the local development plan. So again, loss of housing stock, that's definitely something which we consider. The linguistic impact in terms of the loss of Welsh language and the cultural aspect, again, is something else. Something which we've also seen, and this has been a big issue this year due to the pandemic, is the impact on local infrastructure and parking facilities. The amount of people, when the restrictions were lifted, the amount of people who visited Snowdonia, and the queues to Snowdonia was longer than the queues on any ride in Disneyland. It creates an industry which isn't sustainable, and that's what we need to advocate, is sustainable tourism. Again, Gwynedd and Anglesey are highly dependent on the tourism sector, the local economy. So it's ensuring that that the sector is sustainable. That's what we need to achieve. So yeah.
Okay, right. Thanks very much. And David, these kind of wider issues, in your last answer, you kind of hinted that you were, when you're collecting evidence, it's more to do with, you know, the impacts on amenity and that kind of thing. But I'm assuming that these wider issues are important for you as well.
Absolutely, and moving forward into our next local development plan, these are the issues that are being examined right now with a strong political level of support for addressing that. It's not been a decision-making basis at the moment because we don't have a policy in our existing local development plan against loss of residential use. So that's not given us a robust basis to use that argument. But as I said, moving forward into the next local development plan, we want to introduce a policy on that, which would support the designation of part or all of the city as a control area. That aspect about sustainable tourism needs to be balanced against sustainable communities, and that is a big political issue in Edinburgh at the moment, particularly the city centre communities and the impact of tourism, which is not just accommodation but events and facilities and so on. Getting that balance in an international tourism context, that the centre of Edinburgh, and particularly the World Heritage Site, is not damaged in terms of one of its unique characteristics, which is a very strong residential element within that World Heritage Site. So we're very mindful of the pattern of change which has happened in other historic cities that have got a very high level of tourism, such as Venice or such like.
Okay, thank you. You've both touched on COVID and the impacts of COVID. Obviously, there has been discussion in the press that COVID may see a reduction in use of short-term holiday lets and platforms like Airbnb. In Brighton and Hove, there's been roughly a 25% reduction in the number of properties being advertised on the platforms pre and post COVID. But we've had a question about the specific implications of COVID and whether you are suspending enforcement action in your areas. So that's, I think, a question for all three of you.
Well, I'll start from Cambridge. I mean, we've done it in proportionality. During lockdown, we were getting fresh complaints from our environmental health officers who were dealing with complaints of places being used as Airbnbs during the initial national lockdown period, which I found staggering. People were still wanting to travel to Cambridge for a weekend away. We're all meant to be locked up. You can't legislate for human behaviours, can you? So we're carrying on doing them. We're currently writing appeals and going through appeal processes, and we're currently drawing up new notices. There's still people doing it. We're still getting complaints of harm and loss of amenity. It's still a live issue, and so we're still progressing and taking action.
Okay, thanks very much. David?
I think, Yeah, I think I just add to what John said. Obviously, in the lockdown period, we had a period of about 3 months where this type of accommodation wasn't allowed to operate unless it was providing accommodation for emergency, essential workers that were defined. So it wasn't a planning enforcement issue at that time. It was an issue in terms of regulation of the pandemic regulations. So the reopening of short-term let accommodation, which was disputed by a number of parties, particularly in the context we have in Edinburgh of shared access, where residents were concerned about visitors coming into that environment. The Scottish Government's view was that there's no greater risk there, and that they would not restrict that. So a number of properties obviously are back operating, enforcement activities are back, with cases being investigated after they're reported. A number of properties we know did come out of the short-term let market as owners took decisions that the prospects in terms of letting may not be as good, and they have returned to longer-term rental use, which the council obviously is pleased about. The council also took steps to encourage owners to make properties available to the council in terms of housing homeless, and a number of properties again have moved into that area. So the council's been trying to encourage operators of short-term let properties to think about a more sustainable use for communities and housing. I don't have figures of that, but we have seen a return to pre-lockdown levels of enforcement inquiries, which would suggest to me that the number operating is coming back into the sort of area that we were before.
Okay. All right, thanks very much. Now, Heledd, obviously people from England in the tier 3 areas cannot come into Wales, I believe. But
Wales are going into lockdown this evening anyway, so nobody can go anywhere.
Commiserations.
Thank you.
So what's been you touched on the impacts on the Snowdonia, and certainly we've seen some well publicised examples in Brighton and Hove of people flocking to the beaches during the COVID pandemic. What's the impact been on on this particular aspect of enforcement of short-term holiday lets, if any?
Oh, to be honest, I'm probably ill-equipped to answer the question in terms of enforcement. In all honesty, from my understanding, it's probably going to be business as usual, and I think more and more complaints are definitely coming in, especially as people are at home and able to report the enforcement issues. So yeah, sorry, I'm probably really quite ill-equipped to answer that question.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm sorry for asking you, but one question I think you will know the answer to, hopefully, is when will your research be published?
So hopefully the research will come to an end at the end of November. It will then be put forward to the Cabinet and Gwynedd Council, so then it'll be in the public domain.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Now, I need to wrap up now. We're nearly run over by half an hour. I've been messaging the RTPI organisers, and they tell me there is a NAPE LinkedIn group that all current members should feel free to use to share experiences and questions. I'm very aware that we haven't got round to answer all of the questions, and for that I apologise. But I do thank you for all of the questions that we've had. Some very technical ones, some very general ones, covering a very wide range on this subject. So I think I'll probably direct you to that LinkedIn group. I'm certainly going to be looking at it because I am interested in seeing the trends in particularly appeal statements and in local plan policies in England in particular, to try and tackle short-term holiday lets. So yes, please everyone go to that NAPE LinkedIn group. So it just falls to me to thank all of our panelists. You've all been fantastic, very informative, had a wide range of views and clues about what's coming up in terms of regulation and research around most of the UK. So thank you, John, thank you, David, and thank you, Heledd, and thank you all to the attendees as well for your involvement and your questions. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.